Okay, so let's dive into cycles. As I mentioned in the intro, it is an instrument for contact. So what I need to do is go down to native instruments and find my instance of contact. Now, I have a full version of contact here, but you can use cycles on the free player version of contact, providing it's version 6.2 for either the free or the full version of contact. That's what you need. Let's drag it over into our MIDI track here in Ableton Live. So it's loaded up and we have all our contact instruments in the browser. And just as for the rest of them, Cycles has a drop-down menu for our instruments. And you can see here 3 folders: loops, presets, and a user folder. And obviously the user folder will be blank for now because that is for importing your user-generated loops. So let's open the first one, because first of all we're going to deal with Cycles predominantly as a loop instrument. You'll see here we have 6 further folders of loops with a description for each folder. So without further ado, let's just go into the first one, machine drums. And we have 2 instruments, machines and thresholds. Let's drag machines over and load it up. There we have it. We have a nice clear GUI, and that's one of the strengths of Cycles, despite being one of the most deeply programmed contact instruments I've come across. It really is laid out very intuitively, and you can find everything with a very simple click or 2. Okay, so at the top of the GUI, as with every native instruments contact instrument, you have the regular menus for changing the output, the MIDI channel. Then it gives you indicators for the amount of voices and the memory you're using, the global tuning and the global volume. We're just going to leave those as they are. Now we get down to the GUI for Cycles itself. Now you'll see we have a red strip over on the left hand side and a blue strip here. I will be explaining these later on because I want to keep chapter 1 very simple to explain the concept of Cycles in loop mode. Now, I say loop mode because Cycles isn't just a loop generating instrument. It's also a granular processor synthesizer, and that is indicated by the L, stands for loop, and G, which stands for grain. So you'll see here, if I hover over loop, it's also got a plus button, and we'll be exploring plus and the grain mode in full later on in this tutorial. Clearly, on the left-hand side here, we just have the name of the instrument, and then we have the folder, which was machine drums, and then we have a collection. And note, I say a collection of loops because it's not just one loop. You actually get a collection of loops, which in its normal state is mapped across the keyboard, one loop to each key. And that's why we have this key indicator here, C3. That's the name of the loop. And there you'll see, as I hold the key down, you'll see these grids light up. And if I go up to C sharp, rather than going up in pitch, it will play a different loop. Okay, and obviously that continues up the keyboard. Okay, you get the picture. Now, alongside the key indicator and the loop name, we have loop, which is highlighted. That's because we're in the loop mode. Then we have sequence, and this is for opening the sequence window, and I'm not going to open that quite yet because it's a very important part of Cycles, and we're going to explore that in full later on in the tutorial. And over here we have an expand button, and what I need to do before explaining expand is just go into the basic concept of play direction and slices, because that is basically how we play our loops. So it's important to get the concept of the direction of play, and the best way to do that is to imagine a tape deck type scenario where you can see that Cycles, the designers, have also thought in this kind of method because they have labeled the direction of play as a playhead, as you would have on an old school tape deck, and slices, the loops, split up into different tempo synced slices. Okay, so if we start using audio to explain how this works, the direction is very self-explanatory to begin with, because we simply have playhead highlighted, and you'll see these three controls here are highlighted: direction, the size of the grid, and at the moment we have options for slices which are off. So we're just going to get our mouse, and the way you change this, I was trying to pull the mouse to the left and the right and it wouldn't do anything. You actually just simply hover over the icon and put the mouse up. Okay, so the direction, if I was to now play our C3 loop, what will happen is the direction of play will now be reversed. The slices will stay in their same grid positions, but the slices will be obviously played in reverse, because that's how a tape deck would work. Okay, so pretty self-explanatory. Okay, so that's you can see now already the differences between the play direction and your slices. And the fun really starts when you start combining those two concepts, and you can get all kinds of neat patterns going on. So if we were to change the direction again, you can see here we have a kind of pendulum. It will continue to go forward if I hold the key down, and then it will automatically reverse. Now our next direction is random, and now each time I press a key and then release and then press a key again, it will do a dice throw, and it will either be backwards, there we go, 2 backwards in a row and then a forwards. You can see how the random works. Okay, so that's our playhead, and don't forget, it's important to separate that in your mind from the concept of the slices. The second playhead control that we can change is the grid size. Here you can see our grid is in quarters at the moment, and that represents quarter notes. But before we play around with the grid, I just want to demonstrate something very important, and that is how everything is tempo synced to your DAW. Now, the easiest way to do that, I've created a very simple 1-bar loop of our C3 note. If I were to put the metronome on, you can hear very clearly how everything is tempo synced. And as you watch the grid light up as well, you can see after every bar, and as the note is repressed, the loop gets reset back to the beginning, and that is indicated by a flash on all of the grids across the GUI. Okay, so that's fairly self-explanatory. If I change the master tempo, you'll see it stays perfectly in sync. So that's great for creating polyrhythms and all kinds of different patterns, which we will go into later on. And now we can also tie to that concept, we can see how the grid mode works. At the moment, as I said, we've got it on lighting up every quarter note. If we go up with the mouse, we change all the grids to eighth notes. Sixteenths. Sixteenths is the maximum. You can go right down to 1 bar. Half notes, and back to our quarter notes. Okay, so again, that's fairly straightforward so far. One thing I also want to demonstrate now is these grids here can be turned on and off with a click of a mouse. And this is very, very key to getting some really neat patterns going. So I'm going to change the grid to eighth notes. And obviously, we don't need to change these because we just have a 1-bar loop going at the moment. And if you see, if I click on the first part of the grid here, that would be eliminating the first slice. And then let's also cut out those. Now, this is where the content that comes with cycles is very key, because as you can probably see and hear, the loops, the drum loops certainly that we have here, have been sliced up according to transients, so they make perfect rhythmic sense. And that is, of course, very important, again, for when we try and create some interesting polyrhythms and different patterns as we go forward. So now you can hear you can see that we've deleted 3 of our slices, and that has continued over into our second grid here. So we still have our 8 slices played, it's skipping those 3 and continuing into our second block here. And now if I was to delete this one also, and so forth. Now you can start to see how we can get some really interesting patterns going. Okay, let's stop that for now. Let's keep that on. Now what I'm going to do quickly off screen is put a 4/4 kick drum in, because I like to hear these patterns up against a solid 4/4, and you can see how interesting we can get. So I'll just do that very quickly. Right, so I've just added a very simple 4/4 kick, and so you'll be able to hear the loop against that. Now there are 2 very different techniques when using the mouse to delete the grid. If I was to press stop, and if I was to delete these using the mouse, and you'll see here, it will still count our grid of 8, except it will just miss out those 2 slices and just count those as 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and then 8. So we should be able to see that. Okay, and it resets, and you can see all the grid light up. Nice and neat. Okay, let's change our grid. And when changing the grid like that, you'll see that it still deletes as if we were in, it keeps the settings from the 8th note. Okay, so you can still keep those. Now, what I want to show you is, let's stop again. Let's fill in these again. Now, if I was to delete these whilst the loop was running, something very different will happen. So remember, when we stopped it and deleted the slices, they played as normal, but if you delete them while it's playing along, watch this. Okay, so you can hear now it's overlaying the extra slices that are compensating for deleting these 3 here, but it's playing it over the top of the existing loop, and it's giving it a really nice texture on the note of E3. And if we just press play with slice off at the moment, here we're going to click slice, so put slice on, and now you can see slice direction is now highlighted and becomes a option. And same thing, we can now change the slice direction like we could our playhead direction, and it's the combination of the 2 that really makes for some interesting patterns, especially when you start also using the mouse to delete some of these slices manually. So let's just create a nice little rhythm here. Let's see what this is. Okay, and let's play around with the slice direction. Let's go in reverse. Now you'll see the playhead is going forward, but the slices are being played in reverse. And if we were to now put the direction in reverse, we've got both of them going in reverse. Put slice direction in random and it will play some forward, some backwards, depending on an internal calculation. We've got that pendulum effect. Or we can put both of them in random. And now you'll see it's choosing right across all 4 grids when both of them are in a random mode. And some of the slices are going forward, some of the slices are going backwards, but a really nice way to get some inspiration if you're stuck for a interesting rhythm or a loop. You can put both of these in random, capture the audio, you've got a ready-made loop for you. Okay, so you can see here how the combination of those 2 directions can make for some really interesting patterns. Let's just put all of them straight forward and we can start to have a look at some of these other parameters beside playhead here, because we have signal, random and EQ. Now if we go to signal, you'll see here we have a simple volume button, we have pitch, we have speed and we have panning. Now all of these should be quite self-explanatory, so let's put this in play. Okay, that's very simple. And you hear how seamless the changes are. Half speed. Panning. Okay, so for random you see we have 4 different parameters: volume, pan, octaves and fifths. Now we have 4 small grey circles here, and as we go up with the mouse we can increase the chance that each slice will be affected by this volume change, so you should be able to hear some quieter sections and then a volume leap, and the same with panning. So you should be able to, the higher we go obviously with the value, the more chance you've got of each slice going wildly from left to right, and we'll get into the octaves and fifths in a minute. There you go, it's a nice way to add some random movement in both the dynamics and the left and right spheres. And octaves and fifths does something really neat, because you can do octave leaps in pitch on each slice, and the higher we go up the more chance it has of doing that with each slice. That's a really nice pattern we got going there already. And we can also make those leaps go up in fifths. So if you just want 1 or 2 of those fifths to poke in like that, keep it at a sort of sensible level, or we can have it going a lot of the time. Really nice. You can imagine adding a nice shuffle bit of percussion to this, and already you've got a really good basis for a good groove. Okay, let's go over to EQ. Keep those because they're sounding rather nice. And here you've got a simple 4-band EQ. So if we lower the highs, we can muffle this. Or brighten them. Pretty self-explanatory if you want to do some quick EQ shaping before putting an EQ plug in after cycles. So all very useful there. Right, so we just have one more set of parameters in this basic loop mode to go through, and you can see that these are amp envelope, filter, filter envelope, and effects. And we see here we've highlighted our amplitude envelope, and this applies to each slice. So if we press play and then start to change these parameters, you'll be able to hear the effect that these parameters have. So we can really get this attack nice and tight. You can see here we've got the parameters here in milliseconds, or we can make each transient softer or even drastically take off the initial attack there. Going to create a very subtle ramping effect to get little blips. Let's put that back to 0 milliseconds, so you've got a very punchy kind of transient. And then between decay and sustain, of course, you can shorten or lengthen. And then you've got your release. You can hear now with the release some of the individual slices are kind of, did you hear that? They're kind of overlapping into the next ones, creating a nice kind of almost like a delay effect there. Lots of options there with your amplitude envelope. And then we have a filter. Here we got low pass, high pass, we got our resonance, and we got the amount of envelope, and here is the filter envelope effect, so those two are connected. Of course we can smother it there by using the low pass filter and then open it. Fully open there. We can use a high pass filter, really thin it out, create all kinds of ringing if you want to highlight certain frequencies. You can hear it self-oscillating there, which is a nice feature. You can get some really nice ringing effects. And then we'll get the envelope, go over to the filter envelope, play with some of these. Lots of fun. Okay, and the final one, effects. We have formants here, and this is the formant shift, and you can see it's on 100% right now. Let's take that down. You can hear it's almost like a lo-fi effect once you start to lower that percentage of formants that are used with our loop, or you can even increase it. I really like increasing the amount of percentage on the formats because you get this kind of knocking kind of sound. It's great for kind of techno loops. Let's leave that there, sounding really nice. And we've got a delay here. I'll show you some further effects controls later on in the tutorial because they're a large part of this instrument. And then we have reverb, and here we have reverb type. And we can have a nice spring, or a nice room sound, a larger hall, larger church, and then we have a really large sounding ghost sound. So you can see you can create some really nice background textures like I've just done here, which will go behind a kick really nicely, or you can open it up and go for a full-on kind of in-your-face loop. and end up back again with our nice percussive loop. So you can already see the potential for both loop creation and sound design with cycles. Let's get further into cycles by checking out the Cartesian sequencer. Pressing sequencer, and you'll see the sequencer is still off even when you switch to the sequencer view. Now what I've done here is dragged in a different type of loop. You see here I've dragged it from a folder called Modular, and it's a collection of sounds called Forms, and if I was to play C4 you'll hear this really nice loop. A really nice melodic, slow kind of ambient wash, and what you can see here is the grid is on our quarter notes, so it triggers every quarter note, but this will look slightly different once we put the sequencer on, because the grid control from the sequence page will now dictate how that looks in the loop mode. I'll explain that. Let's turn the sequencer on. Now immediately if I press play you'll hear something quite different. Now the grid is on 16ths, so if we switch over to loop mode you'll see here that this is now switched over to 16ths, but of course the original grid had it triggering just initially on each quarter note, so that still is retained. So you've got this kind of, well, I guess it could be confusing, but now I've explained it to you, hopefully it won't be. But now you've got this sort of pattern where just the first row is being triggered. And if we go back to our sequence view, you'll see our 4 sequence grids, different parameters within our sequencer all going along nicely. And let's get into some of these now. Now first of all, let's just go into the basic settings. We've got sequencer on. Latch mode is very simple. If I just click the key once and then click it again, it goes off. So I don't need to sit here and hold down C4, which is quite handy for me. Speed, again, very self-explanatory. If we go into loop mode, you'll see it also now dictates our loop speed. Half speed there, okay. Grid, which I've just explained, and then length. This is something different. The length of the sequencer can be full, which will mean it will go and utilize all of the squares within each of our grids here. Let's change that. There we go. If you're wondering why that goes up to all the way up to 64, that's because of various other parameters that we can bring into play. Well, let's leave this full at the moment and go down to our next parameter, which is scale, set at octave and a fifth, and that will quantize our pitch, which is our first sequence grid here. It will sequence it to only fall on those notes, and you may notice that this looks vastly different from the other, and that's because we've got no info in here at the moment because I pressed reset on this. So if we start putting in some pitch info, now you'll see with the mouse here I can go down with the mouse and go black, and then work through various shades of grey and go to bright white. Now, as I do that, you'll see the pitch parameter change here, and because we're working in octaves and a fifths, it only shows +12, +5 semitones, and that's down to our normal note pitch, and then -5 semitones, -12 semitones. And that will of course change depending on which scale you've got. You can see we've got just octaves, and then we can just change from white down to 0, down to -12. And you can of course have a chromatic scale which will give us access to each of those individual semitones. Now what I'm going to do here is just generate a random pattern, and you can do that on each of these grids by just pressing generate. Okay, so you can see it's generated some that will be -12, semitones +7, etc, etc. And if I put latch mode on, so I can just hit this note once, and if we now play our loop, you'll hear it's vastly different. Okay, so what are each of these grids doing? Well, the name of them and the parameter that it's affecting is neatly on the left hand side of each. Pitch, position, volume, direction. Okay, so our second sequencer changes the position, and if we go back to our loop view, we can check to see how this works. So at the moment we've got a grid of 16, and so if we click on our first grid, you'll see this preset sequence here starts on number 1, and then it goes up in an increment of, it jumps number 2 and goes to 3, so it completely covers all the way up to 32. And that of course is why if we click on our loop mode, it's simply going in a very linear fashion. Now if I was to change this first parameter, you'll see what I mean. Let's choose 16, and you'll see now if we go over to loop mode, the first segment will be around here somewhere. There you go. So you can quite easily see if we generate our random pattern using our gen button, we can jump all over the loop, and maybe we can get a bit more musical by slowing the speed down. Going into our loop, maybe changing there we go. So you can see the potential of using the sequencer in combination with some of the amplitude envelope effects to get even deeper into your sound design. If we go to our third block here, that dictates the volume, and at the moment everything is on 100%, so you should know by now we can change these values by the mouse, or we can just generate a random value. If you don't like the random, you can reset it and do it by hand again. So it's all very intuitive. Now this should change some of the volume levels. And the final sequencer grid that we have here is for the direction. We have just two options here. We can go black or white by clicking on or off for forward and reverse. You can see how you can quite quickly build up. Just using the reverb effect. There are some more controls for the effects, so I'm going to get into those later on in the tutorial. Presets that Slate and Ash have created for you. That's not just the content, it's certain preset parameters as well, and we can access many of these from within the sequencer. First of all, you'll see these coloured square buttons here with A, and if we cycle through those, you can see that they've created all the way up to Z, 24 various presets, so you can reset any of these at any time if you don't like them back to the default position. So I've got a new loop here, which is I've put a 4/4 kit because it's quite a nice kind of techno sounding loop, quite menacing, and now it's all on the same pitch at the moment. put a few octave leaps in there, or we could generate, or we could use these presets. And you can see a lot of thought has gone into these as you try various ones out. They're really suited for loop manipulation. And of course you can, if you don't want to use what someone else has created for you, you can simply use those as a starting point and then edit them to your heart's content. And of course you can do that for each of these 4 sequencer grids here. So if you want to change the position grid, if you want A, by the way, you just click on it. That's really nice. We can experiment with maybe changing the scale. So let's go down to a minor scale, and then really interesting stuff. Can create some like gating like effects with the volume using large volume jumps. We'll reset it and get it back to full volume for each of the slices. And then we got our forwards and backwards. That's really nice. Now this preset pattern concept is continued with the movement of the sequencer itself. And we've got 4 parameters down on the right hand side. We've got pattern, rhythm, start and repeat. Now similar to these squares here, pattern and rhythm go from A to Z. So you've got 24 different presets for each of those, and you can combine those with endless different combinations for different results. And start, you can change the start position of the cursor for your loop, your sequence loop, from 1 to 16, and then you can set an amount of repeats for each stage before the cursor will move on to the next stage of the sequence. Now I'm actually going to demonstrate start and repeat first, because we're used to hearing this loop by now, and it's just before we get into changing the pattern and the rhythm, I think it'll be easier to hear what's going on. So if we press play, you can see we're starting from the first slot in our sequence, and then very simply, let's start from number 4. We should start our sequence from here. There we go. And you can obviously put the emphasis on that note. It's really nice actually. Now repeat. Now you can see when we use repeat why when we were looking through the length parameter it went all the way up to 64, even though we've only got 16 in our grid. And that's because you can repeat each segment up to 8 times before the cursor will then move on. Pretty crazy, huh? Okay, so you can fine-tune your loops using the start point and the amount of repeats before you move on to the next stage. Right, so let's put those back to how they were, and now we have to go on to pattern and rhythm, and they might seem sort of the same thing at first, but they are very different, because pattern, and you've got, as I said, 24 of these. You can see pattern is changing the way the cursor moves around within the sequencer, as opposed to rhythm. You can see sometimes the rhythm pauses, sometimes it stays on one of the segments for a lot longer than the others, and it kind of changes up the rhythm rather than the actual pattern. And the idea is to combine pattern and rhythm to get the exact loop that you're after. And of course, combined with the start point, you can really dive in and get exactly the kind of sound that you're after. So they're the 4 parameters from preset rhythms that you can use within the Cartesian sequencer. Now this preset concept is taken to its ultimate by Slate and Ash within Cycles with what's called loop states. And you access the loop states by hovering over our L here and clicking on the plus icon, and you'll see here load loop state, and then we've got basic, we've got sequence, textural, rhythmic and gestural, and they've created some really basic ones. So if we were to click on 8-note odd, you'll see the pattern of on off. So if we were to play that, we've got a nice metallophone loop going. And if we were to change that maybe into a random, so again, if you need some inspiration, you can very quickly load these loop states. These ones affect the sequencer. So let's go into Snake. You'll see here it switches neatly to sequencer mode. You can see they've set up a rather neat pattern where it kind of moves around in 2D, creating a circling pattern like a snake. And this is really key to Cycles, actually, is using these loop states, because Slate and Ash have really spent a lot of time tailor making these to really get the most out of some of these preset loops for you. And of course, all these are editable. We've shown you now how to use every parameter within loop and the sequencer mode, so you should be able to work your way around it and fine tune it to however you like. But make sure, you know, if you really want to get some inspiration, make sure to check out these loop states. They give you lots of ideas for creating your own loops. You can see how to utilize Cycles to its real potential. Okay, so before we leave our loop and sequencer mode, we've just got this parameter to explain, which is expand. Now I've chosen like a fret type sound, like a guitar. Normally we just have it in normal mode. You know, find a different loop on each note. Okay, some really nice guitar type sounds. Now if we to use expand, we can go into poly mode, and this now takes that loop and spreads it across the keyboard according to pitch, so we can now play it like a normal kind of piano sound. And you can play any of the loops like that. To get to a different loop, just go back to normal mode and then play that, and then go into expand, go into poly mode. Okay, and then it's got an arpeggiator mode, so if I was to play two notes, hold down 3, etc. And then we've got hold mode, and now this spreads out the segments in our loop across the keyboard and holds them according to the grid length. So if I was to hold down a note, if I was to change the grid, now you'd get 16ths. Get some interesting effects going on there. And then you've just got one-shot mode, so every time you just hit one of the keys, it just plays one of the segments rather than holding them. Okay, so that just explains expand mode. Okay, just before we go into grain mode, we need to check out these red and blue bars here. And if we click on our red bar, you'll see some global parameters. The first two are very simple, just output -6 dB to prevent any clipping, I guess. And then the obligatory bend range for your pitch wheel goes up to +12 or down to 0. EQ, we've got everything flat here, but you could put an extra load of bottom end if you wanted to, for example. But these loops are the ones that we're going to show you, because these are a little bit tricky to get your head around. It took me a while to figure these out. But basically, the parameters, first of all, in global mode, which is what we have it at the moment, as we change the loop by going up the keyboard, you'll see the direction is going forward. Now, if we were to stop that and put the direction on that loop to going backwards, of course it goes backwards, but then when we change the loop, you'll see that all the other loops are going backwards as well. Okay, now if we change this, if we now change that to going forward again, all the loops will be going forward. We're in global mode. Change that to per loop mode. We now choose a preset, press play. We should be able to make that go backwards, and we should be able to press play and go to our next preset, press play, change that to maybe random. You can see the directions going random. Let's do it at reverse. And if we go back to this preset, we can go forward. And then if we go back to this preset, it's still going on reverse. So you can choose per loop different parameters. The next parameter is scrubbing, and what scrubbing does is the same for parameters per loop. So you can change scrubbing, put it to per loop, and in normal global mode, what happens is you play a preset. Okay, and then you change that to the next one. It's keeping the same pattern that we have in our grid, but what this enables us to do in per loop mode, now we go back to our original loop. Okay, and then we go to this loop, and let's go back to this loop. So we've got different, they call it scrubbing when you erase some of the segments. So if you want to do that separately per loop, you go to that global parameter there. Erase has an option of splice or gap. Splice is the one that we've been using throughout this tutorial, and that is, it will skip any of the segments that we've got blacked out and just go on and count 1, 2, and then 3, 4, 5, like that. But if you change it to gap mode, it will actually count these and it will silence them. So you can get like a kind of stuttering effect, as opposed to the normal splice mode. Okay, so you can see these three parameters here. Don't neglect them. They're hidden away in this red strip here, but they are very useful for setting up all kinds of stutter and different complex effects using multiple loops across the keyboard. Okay, moving across to the other side of the GUI, and we have this blue strip here, and if we click on that, it opens up a whole world of processing and spatial effects, selected by pressing on either one of these. Now, processing, you'll see here we have loss, lo-fi, drive, smear, tremolo, and chorus, and then as you select each of those effects, you have a set of parameters which you can further change to really tailor the sound of your processing effects. So you can see how deep this instrument really is. It's incredible, really. So let's play our loop and just go through some of these. So here we go with our loss effect, and as we Raise our mouse, we increase the amount of loss. So you can really hear it there. And then you can further adjust these effects using these parameters down here. So if we continue, we can mono that effect. We can take down some of the echo. Get rid of the little spring reverb that is in there. And then take that right down. And then let's go to the lo-fi. Let's bring that right up. And we can increase the noise. Hear that come up there? It's like a kind of wow and flutterer of a tape deck. Drive. Guess you can get the idea now. Very simple, you just raise the effect amount using these controls here, and then you further adjust the parameters of each of these effects separately down at the bottom here. Smear. It's like a widening effect. Tremolo. Do that quite subtle. And then chorus. A nice doubling. Okay, so that's all pretty self-explanatory, and then we go on to spatial effects. Get like a reverse reverb type effect, very popular in early Detroit techno. We put the kick behind it. That's sounding great. You can change the reverb amount in general. We've got a nice delay sound. All our different parameters here that you'd expect. Ping pong effect. Shifting the delays left and right. Great stuff. Okay, so again, that's hidden away in this blue strip. Okay, so we've had a thorough look at loop mode and sequencer mode. We've also checked out the global parameters and the effects parameters. Let's get into granular mode, because Cycles isn't just a loop manipulator, loop processor, it's also a granular processor. And if we click G here, we go into grain mode. And there you'll see the GUI changes quite a bit. We still have our 4 grids, where we've got 16 of them in each here. And we have all these parameters down here for grains, and we also have another random set of parameters, just like we have in loop mode. And over here we have some effects, and then we have a source mode. I think the easiest way to explain this is to play the loop as it is in loop mode. Okay, and then switch over to grain mode. As you can hear, totally different, both very beautiful. It's very hard to explain the fundamentals of grain mode with all the modulation that's going on in the preset loops that you drag in from the browser. So off camera, I'm going to reset all the parameters to 0, because then I can start to explain from the ground upwards, as it were, what is going on with all these 4 grids here. Okay, so I'll just do that very quickly. Okay, so I've put everything basically to 0. Here we go down to our parameters. For grains, we have grain position, grain density, we have an envelope shaper here, we have the size of the grain, we have the volume, we have the tuning of the grain, and you can see I've set that to the middle, which is actually 0. And then we have grain scale. Volume is up as well because obviously we want to be able to hear something, so I've got it at 0 dB, but everything else is at 0. If we click into random mode, I've also turned off all these random modulations, which I'm going to explain in a bit. If we press play now, you're not going to hear anything. All you're going to see is just one of these segments lit up. Now if I was to change the grain position from here, you'd see it simply goes across all of the 4 grids. We can bring it back again, but we can't really hear anything, and that's because we have such a small grain size and the density. So let's start working on some of these. You see the density, that's 2 every bar. Then we got triplets, we got 1 every bar. Let's go to 16ths here. You might be able to hear that now. Open the size up. There we go. Now what that's doing, you can hear that's repeating the very first segments there that we've got of our loop. And then as the position moves along, we're kind of scanning along the loop. Okay, so the density, you can hear that it's doing it in 16ths. If we were to slow that down, and then back again. Of course, the size, if we reduce the size, you hear it just kind of clicks. And then we have this envelope, and you can hear that it's softening the attack. And here we have scale, so we can change it from chromatic to major, minor. Let's try and find that octave and a 5th scale. There we go. And the tuning, we can keep it 0. Because it's a nice kind of basic pitch. And yeah, that's it. That's our grain part. So what on earth was going on when we first played this in grain mode? Well, that is because of the modulation. And we're going to dedicate a chapter to modulation in a bit. But first of all, we're going to use the random modulation to start bringing this grain processor to life. So here you have, again, parameters down at the bottom. So this is the position, and we're going to introduce some random modulation to the grain position. That's really nice. Just bring in a bit of delay here. Okay, and here we have the random timing. At the moment, you can hear the changes are all regular. We're going to introduce some irregular random movement into that kind of rather staccato sound. I think I'm going to keep that just a tiny bit of random in there. Now some of these can go backwards. That's nice. Maybe keep it down there. Let's get some panning from left to right, introduce some randomness. That's really nice. And we have our volume. I don't really want to have big volume leaps, so we'll just keep that nice and subtle as well. And now we can introduce octaves at random. Don't forget, the higher the random amount, the more chance there is of these parameters actually kicking in. So a high value and you'll get lots of those octave leaps. A low value and you'll just get the odd one or two. And we can introduce some really nice analog like pitch drift. Again, a subtle setting, otherwise starts to sound like a broken tape machine. So that's a really nice way to introduce a bit of analog drift, just 1 or 2% of random amount. And maybe we can go back to our basic parameters and start changing some of these. It's a nice kind of ambient pad. Don't forget you've got these effects on the right hand side. We can thin this sound out. Or we can take some of the top off for a really warm sound. And there we have it. That's basically how grain mode works. We've worked all the way up from the very bottom, putting everything to 0, and you can see how the grain parameters and random parameters work in tandem to get the movement. And now we can move on to the XY mode. XY mode, it looks pretty complex at first glance, but once you get into it, you'll see, as with everything in cycles, it is very intuitive and it's a lot of fun. I actually love XY mode. It's probably my favorite part of the granular side of things, actually, because you get a lot of manual control over it. So you'll see you have 4 grids and 2-dimensional, and you have these colored balls inside each of the squares. And you have new sets of parameters both underneath those grids. So we have movement, modulation, and I'm not going to go through modulation because we've got that coming up in a whole chapter. And then we've got record mode, and that's the same for each of the 4 grids. And then we have XY parameters: structure, speed, time, resolution, spatial resolution. We have physics and link mode parameters. Okay, so first of all, I'm just going to play the loop that I've selected. It's from the Metallophones folder, and this particular loop is called Abstractions. A lovely thing. Let's see what's going on in grain mode. You see, if I move the position, it stays pretty constant. Okay, so back to XY mode. Now at the moment, the modulation for this loop called sleeping is just controlled by the base setting that we have in grains parameters and then any randomization that we've added. Now we can override those and control these with XY. Now the easiest way to explain this, first of all, is to manually move these balls around. Okay, so I'm going to press play on the loop, and you'll see written inside each of these squares is a description of what you are actually going to modulate manually moving this ball. So in this first grid here, I'm going to affect what they call collectively the grains. So if I move this around, you'll hear the effect. Okay, now to get a visual idea of what we're doing, I can put this in record mode and then move this around, holding the mouse down, and then once I release the mouse, it will remember the movement that we've made. Okay. Now let's go back into grains and let's have a look what it's doing. Now you can see it's affecting the density parameter. Let's see if it's affecting anything within the random modulation, and there you go, it's affecting all of them except for the drift. Wonderful. Okay, so we go back into XY mode. We can turn that off, and we can put that manually back to a setting where we can hear our loop. If we can go to the next grid, and this time it's going to affect a group of parameters they call window. So let's move this and see what it sounds like. We're getting little blips. Now you can hear it's like a release envelope. So let's record a bit of movement here. Let's see what it's doing. Let's go back into grain mode. Nothing on the random side of things, but you'll see here it's changing both the envelope shape, softening out the attack, losing the transient, and then it's affecting the grain size. Okay, back into XY mode. Let's turn that off. Let's again put that manually into a position where we can hear our loop clearly. We go on to our third grid, and this is what they call color. Okay, let's see what that sounds like. Okay, so it's dulling it and then brightening it as we go over towards that corner. Okay, let's record that movement. Go back into grains. Let's see what that's affecting. And there we go. It's modulating our low pass filter and our high pass filter. That's a really nice effect actually. Especially if you do it slowly like we've done there. Okay, let's take that out of record mode and put it back in the corner. And finally we have a description called space. So I imagine this will probably affect the reverb that we've got going on. Yep, it's making the reverb larger, and I suspect that will make it a lot tighter. So let's record that in. Let's go to our grains. You can see it's affecting the number of repeats for each grain, and also our reverb, our spatial effects. Okay, let's take that out, put it back in the center. Okay, we can stop there. So you can see what each of these XY grids is doing very clearly. If we go down to the XY parameters now, you'll see we have structure. You see the names within each of these grayed out squares. These will change as you change the structure. So if we go up to structure B, now you'll see that the first window is called repeat, and then we've got density, pitch, and then random. So these will be completely different. If we put them in record mode, we should be able to get the patterns that we recorded again. Already you can hear how, because we got the pitch right up, it's already sounding very odd. So let's move the pitch down. Oh wow. It's almost like some kind of 50s sci-fi experimental music. Let's lower the number of repeats probably. Yeah, that's like a tape deck type effect. Oh wow, this is fantastic. Okay. Amazing stuff. Okay, let's stop the loop there, and then we go on to structure C. That now changes to window, grains, cloud, and space. Let's open the window. I guess that's the size of the grains. Let's see what cloud does. Let's get our movement from cloud, and again space. So lots of potential for sound design. And finally, we have one more preset structure: stretch, filter, cluster, and grains. If you find that the pitch is a bit too high, just simply go back into grains and you can bring it back down again, the base value. Crazy stuff. If we turn these off, we can link them. And if you press link, the first one that you press link on, the ball inside your grid will get a white circle around it, and that means it is the master. And now all of these that we press link on, let's link the third and the fourth grid to that first grid. These will now follow the movement of the ball with the white ring around it. So if we now put that into record mode, you'll see the movement that we recorded on the first one is now replicated on these. If we press play, we can now play around with the link parameters that become active once you have linked one or two of your grids. So we've got strength first of all. 100% strength, that means that it is following the master very strictly. It's just completely replicating its movement, but you can lessen the strength and it will start to move away slightly, and then it will start to veer away quite a lot, still based on the original movement, but you can kind of get these circling patterns and clusters by lowering the strength, and you can smooth the movement out in case you have any jerky kind of extreme movements when you're recording it in. This will smooth those jagged edges of your curves out. And then we have offset, and this is really cool because now it will follow the master, but it will delay the following by a set amount of time. The more you increase it, the more it's like a delay on the movement. And then entropy, you can create some quantum chaos to your original movement. And so you've gone from it just replicating this master to now being related to it, and you can get all kinds of cool sounds by just closely replicating it rather than following it exactly. Let's bring the tuning back up. Always nice to go back to the grain mode so you can fine-tune your bass settings if these XY modes really start messing up your sound. And let's go back to our A structure here, and let's think it was like this. That was in the center, and those two were kind of up around here somewhere. And let's have a look at the XY parameters: speed, time, resolution, and spatial resolution, and our physics movements. Okay, so we press the loop. Let's go back and lower that tuning a little bit. There you go. Okay, so speed. Let's get a preset movement that we have here. You see here movement. So you can see, as well as recording your own manual movements, using record, you have these set movements for each of the different structures. So we can slow the movement down. That's a really nice sound now. Excellent stuff, love that. Okay, let's play around with the time resolution. At the moment it's full, but then we've got divisions of our master BPM, and you can create a kind of jerky feel. You see now the movements are only updating every 8th note depending on our master tempo. We can make that really jerky now. See, it's only updating the position every quarter note. And the same with our spatial resolution. You can create some really jerky kind of sounds combining these two together. Or you can have them totally smooth, get back nice and ambient. And the physics, well, that dictates how these balls move around, how they react. And the first one is magnetism. Now you'll see these crosshairs in the center of the XY axis, and that's going to act like a supermassive black hole for these dots. Imagine these dots are the stars that are moving around and are going to get swallowed by the black hole. As we increase the magnetism, you'll see they get drawn towards it, and then they start orbiting around, and then there's no escape as you put it on full. They're going completely crazy around the center. And then bounce, well, that dictates how there's a physical modeling calculation about how they bounce off the edges. Momentum is all about energy. You can see here the balls have pretty much stopped moving around now. And instability again adds a bit of randomness. You can see it's just moving around there rather than staying static. Modulation, we just have a couple of things to point out before we leave the grain mode, and that is to say that it also has a sequencer mode, and this is identical to the one in the loop mode, so no need to go through it here. It's got exactly the same parameters, the patterns, the rhythms, etc. So go back to the chapter on the sequencer within the loop mode if you want to know. Give yourself a reminder how that works, so we can turn that off now. And likewise, when we were in loop mode and we hovered over it and we got those loop states, which were really nice presets made by Slate and Ash, we got the same for the granular mode. And if you hover over, you'll get a plus, and then we can load certain grain states. So let's just play this loop. Now we press stop, and then we choose one of these grain modes. Let's choose circles. Very powerful sound. It's affecting the space radically, and the color, the window, and the grains. So we can choose another one of these. Let's choose a nice ambient one. Let's choose drift. Let's see what this does. Fantastic for sound design. Great to get ideas to start your own presets when you use these grain states, or edit some of them for your own tastes. Right, that's grain mode, and let's go back into loop mode so that we can show you the modulation. Now you'd think there might not be enough room to squeeze any more modulation capabilities into cycles, but they've done it in a very clever way. If we hover over these parameters for playhead, direction, grid and slice, you'll see nothing actually changes, they stay lit. However, if we go over to, say, filter parameters and hover over the words low pass and high pass, you can see they become grayed out, and that is because they can be modulated. So let's play this loop. Okay, and if we modulate the high pass filter by clicking on it and turning modulation on, we can set up a nice LFO. You'll see here if I play the loop now. The LFO is modulating the high pass filter. We can change the shape of the LFO. Put it on random, set it to divisions of our master tempo. Change the phase, smooth the LFO out. We got sync to the master tempo, or we can have it free running. Have the rate in hertz, goes up to 5 hertz maximum. Right down to really slow, 0.1, 0.01 even. And of course we can map MIDI CC as well to modulate some of these features as well. Don't forget that. I'm not going to go into that now because everyone has their own different way of mapping MIDI. Just to say that the MIDI CC capability is there. I'm not sure. I don't think that Cycles is mapped to the Native Instruments NKS format. I think some of the parameters need to be constant for them to be able to do that. So I don't think that those two work together. I might be wrong. Update me. Maybe they'll do an update and do that. But as of now, I don't think that's possible. But yeah, you can see now as you go along in each kind of mode, like loop mode, you'll see all the different parameters that you can modulate. So if we go back to our filter here in high pass, let's turn that off and let's carry on with our original loop. Let's turn the high pass down. Let's maybe go to effects here. You can see we can click on formants, we can modulate it. That's the maximum value and the minimum value. So you can really fine tune the amount of modulation, even between set amounts. That's fantastic. Again, change the shapes, etc., etc. So you got the visual display showing the amount of modulation. If we go into our sequencer mode, turn our sequencer on, you'll see pattern, rhythm, start and repeat. You can't modulate. That sounds fantastic. Let's put a kick behind that. Excellent stuff. If we go into grain mode, let's get the volume right down, and you can see here, while my CPU struggles a little bit as we just flip into grain mode, all of these are modulatable. So we got the position here, excellent. You can modulate the size. Go into XY mode. can modulate some of these, but you can't modulate others. Let's put the movement on. None of these you can modulate. I think it's the things that take a lot of CPU that would create a lot of problems if you try to make everything modulatable. So I think they've just done the effects and certain other parameters that won't completely destroy your computer if you try to modulate them in real time like that. So that's how you use modulation within Cycles. It's all fairly simple once you know how, and all that's left now is for me to show you how to create some user content. And believe me, granular synthesis is something that's notoriously difficult because some of the source content just doesn't sound very good. And Slate and Ash have, obviously spent a lot of time thinking about what kind of sounds work best. But with Cycles, it's really easy to import your own user content. And again, you'll probably have to go through a process of trial and error to find what works best. But it's such an easy process to do this. So let's have a look at this right now. So if you've got a sample folder handy, I've just got a few samples here. I'm going to use this hi pad. All you do is you see you've got your three folders, loops, presets and user. You want to open user. This is very important. If you just drag in your sample, it's not going to load unless you have this preset loaded, and it's called user sources NKI. You just drag that over and it will take a short time to load. And then it's really as simple as dragging and dropping. I think you can even do this from within your Finder. You don't have to do it from within the browser of your DAW, but it's really simple for me. All I have to do is drag it in. And if I do that again, just so you can see, drag and drop samples here. For loops, tempo sync to work correctly, loops must be 4 bars at 75 to 140 BPM. Okay, so drag that in and it will immediately go to C3. So make sure you've got your note on C3. And if we just play this, I'm not worried about the tempo at all. Sounds quite nice around there. What I really want to get into is the grain mode for this. So let's get into grains. Let's see what it sounds like. Beautiful stuff. Let's change the position. Beautiful sound. Let's get the tuning down a fifth. Let's modulate the low pass here. There we go. I don't want the sound to drop out too much, so you can really fine tune the minimum value on the left and the maximum value on the right. Let's get back into our grain mode. I'll tell you what we'll try. Let's try some of these grain states. Let's try a nice ambient one called Infinite. Wow. And then let's mess around with the position. If I go to random, amazing stuff. those kind of pads work really well, as you can hear. That was just a completely, I swear to you, that was a completely random sample that I've just used. I just had a feeling that something like a nice pad with a chord progression would work really well as you move through the grains using the position. So, a successful experiment straight off. I really have gone through as much as I can think of in cycles. It is pretty deep, especially for a contact instrument. I mean, I've never seen anything like it, but it's one of the most inspiring instruments I've played around with for a very long time, and I highly recommend it.